Hello, and welcome to the webinar, Creating a One-Stop Shop Experience for Campus Services. My name is Eric Wallace with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have a few administrative details to share with you, then we'll dig into our presentation. First, we'd like to thank Freshworks for their partnership with today's event. They've been wonderful thought leadership partners to Argyle, and they're committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. So thank you again to Freshworks. We appreciate you joining us today. We welcome you to stay connected during today's event. For those of you who are active tweeters, please follow us on Twitter at Argyle Exec Forum. I also wanted to take a moment to touch on our content neutrality policy, which we've curated based on the feedback we've received over the years from our members. Argyle is very proud and protective of this policy, as it reflects our commitment to ensure the neutrality and overall value of the content presented at our events. We've worked closely with our speaking faculty to ensure that you receive a set of balanced and neutral viewpoints during the session today, and we appreciate our member support of this policy. Finally, and most importantly, please submit all questions that come up during today's event into the chat section of the interface. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Shelton Wagoner, President at CIO Perspective, and Chris Shagnon, ITSM Architect at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Panel, over to you.
Hello, everyone. So I am going to be spending a bit of time talking about the top 10 challenges that are facing higher ed for IT service management and enterprise service management in 2022. Now, as much as I would like to make this just a session where I complain about my day-to-day and why my life is hard, I'm actually going to do my best to offer some advice or how we can address those problems. Now, if you're not from a higher ed organization, please don't think that this is strictly a higher ed talk. My goal is for us to discuss some of these problems and for you to be able to get something out of it and say, well, this actually applies to my organization too. I think that higher ed is a really good laboratory or a place for us to work on some of these things because we do have a rapidly changing environment and we do end up getting a lot of the needs from our students and our diverse body of people who are end users. So as we think about what our first problem is, we want to talk about the shrinking world. So the pandemic, as we all know, has meant that, we are now in a world of no more snow days, is how we think about it. We will never have a day where we have no more snow because we've set up this infrastructure for us to have telepresence, Zoom meetings, online things, anywhere and everywhere that we have. With that, in higher ed, we also tend to have study abroad, global project centers, and different aspects of how we offer our education everywhere. They're all around the world and they still need our resources no matter where they are. Another big problem that we're starting to see, and it's not so much a problem, is that with flexible work from home, international students who might be taking courses remotely or outsourcing of our own organizations or aspects and services that we provide means that our people or the people that we work with can also be anywhere. In the end, this isn't so much a big problem as something that we do need to manage. So when we think about how we might manage that from the perspective of this, I wanted to provide this context here, looking at some of our analytics, just showing this is our self-service portal analytics. And these are, the darker the blue, the more people are using it. Clearly, we are in Massachusetts, so United States is going to be one of our top places. But when we look at the countries, we have people using our self-service and our tooling from all over the world. There are very few countries that don't have people, and the countries that don't, I do always wonder. I think maybe we should take a vacation, try to light some of those up blue as well. Or maybe call a friend to see if we can get some of those last remaining holdouts. But as I think about how we might address this problem that we're seeing with the shrinking world, is we need to make sure that what we offer is globally accessible. From the perspective of self-service, this means that we can't frame things from the perspective of what we traditionally did. And that means considering how we support our people. If we might have something that says, stop by the service desk and we'll be able to get that device set up for you, that might not always be possible. So as we think about how we're able to offer those services, we need to think, what does that look like for our users, and is it still self-serviceable no matter where they are? If it requires connecting to a special network or using a specialized piece of software or access to something they might not have, we might want to consider, do we need to write additional knowledge, or do we need to reframe how some of our self-service works there? And then this last little bullet is one of these things that we do unfortunately need to start considering, which has, been really interesting to cope with, is geopolitics, policies, and solutions around the world. If there are sanctions against a country, we might not be able to actually let them use our self-service. And those are things that we never thought we would have to deal with as knowledge brokers. I don't think that we should be seeking those things out on our own, but we should definitely be working with whatever those groups inside of our organizations are that manage some of those things and see if we're doing things on the up and up. In those cases where, for example, we're not able to offer service to people in a certain area for political reasons or policy reasons, we might need to figure out, is there a way that we can support those people, or do we still have people in those areas too? The next primary issue I see with this, which is an extension of it, is the blurred lines that we've created. So for the longest time, we've been focusing on technology as this IT thing. IT gets the technology, and I know that we've always had bits of shadow IT, and we've always had bits of people doing this, but technology is pervasive and ubiquitous now, and everyone is doing their own things with it. It is no longer this process of, we're buying this mainframe computer that IT must manage and maintain. It is, we're buying this thing because I saw this really cool ad, or I went to this conference, or I saw this different thing at a convention, and I want it for my area. So that means that we have departments, divisions, and even people at the team level buying their own solutions. They might have seen a really cool, note-taking tool or a spreadsheet tool or one of those really cool enhanced workflow or low-code solutions that they might want to use, and it's not being handed down to them from IT as a resource. And then the wild one for us is they might actually even like these solutions. We're used to the world of, well, here's the tool that we're using, and it just makes life easier, but you might not enjoy it. However, they might have this tool that is a niche market or fits their specific needs, and they enjoy it, and they might even enjoy it more than the ones that we already provide. So this creates this really weird space of, is this shadow IT? And what I mean by that is it something that's shadow IT if we kind of already know about it, and if they enjoy using it, we need to start considering how we're able to support that. So the best way to get ahead of this is to come up with processes and governance and other ways that we can support it and get ahead of it. We'll need to consider the implications of purchasing or using this, as well as who's going to support it, because the departments themselves might not actually have the resources to support it, and we need to make sure that we document all of this stuff ahead of time. So while they might have this tool that is very specific to their needs and they really enjoy using it, we will want to go ahead and state how we're going to be able to support that. So making sure that we have clearly defined processes and even governance for purchasing that, and statements of support and what we're going to support for it, is also something that's very helpful. This can feed into something like a service catalog, or even just agreements between the departments, or setting a point person for who's that business contact, who's that service contact for it. But defining that's going to be a lot better than letting it happen and just saying, well, sorry, we didn't know about it down the line. With that in mind, the biggest trend that has been going on for a few years now, it's not brand new, but the switch from IT service management to enterprise service management is something that we all know is happening. We all might even enjoy it. It's been happening. We really love that it's happening, and we feel like we're such an enabler of positive change throughout the organizations. However, it is growing, and the resources to support it might not be growing. So we start to have this growth from ITSM to ESM, and we have our entire, university, different departments, divisions, teams using it. And what went from being an IT-centric user base of people doing tickets is now a bunch of business units managing all of their workflows, process automations, and continual process improvements, which is super awesome, but we still have that same team of, a handful of people managing it. So thinking about that, this is something that we do want to continue to support. We want to make sure that we are helping people do this, and we want to make sure that our users have one place to go for it. With that in mind, we do need to think about how to make this feel regular, and that it's something that we do. We don't want people to feel like we are, they're a nuisance for asking, hey, we don't want to use an inbox anymore. Can we use the ticketing system, or can we use your service management tool? You should come up with an onboarding process, and you should have training and documentation, things available to make this feel like something that you just do and that teams can have. This should start to feel more like, yeah, we're going to set you up with email. You might still offer training or things like that, but you want it to start feeling very regular and commoditized overall. The resources thing is something that we'll all need to work on together. So definitely make sure that you're resourcing your teams. That's really helpful. But if we start to make this feel more regular and more like a process, every new person or group that we're onboarding won't feel so overwhelmed. The next big challenge that we're seeing is the changing of channels amongst our users. So email might still reign supreme. It might be that number one thing that everyone is using. But we might start seeing some of these other channels coming into play. A big one that we're seeing in higher ed is the switch to some of these social platforms like Discord, Reddit, Slack, where it is these micro communities of users, but they are talking about things amongst themselves and coming up with their own support methodologies and the ways that they're working with that. And sometimes that creates its own little shadow IT where we have our users helping our users, and we might not ever hear about an issue. With that in mind, though, we don't want to be against the use of these channels. We do want to think about, how do we support them in the right way? Because our users are going to continue to use new channels, but we need to make sure that we're doing it. My biggest advice here is don't adopt it just because. I'm going to say this here. You can quote me on it. You can tweet it. IT does not need a TikTok. If you want to do your dances and everything like that in your own time, that is really great. But having a channel just because it is the popular one might not be the best one for you. You need to have a strategy about it, and you need to talk to your users about how they might use it. When I say don't pander, because of that example of TikTok, there's generally not going to be a great reason for you to be on there unless you really do have people staffing it, resourcing it, and checking comments, checking DMs for a way to help that. Unless you're offering important material through there, maybe micro videos for learning and things, and that might be a good way to use the platform. If you're offering it as a point of support or a point of contact, you want to make sure that it is an appropriate channel for your use. You'll see here the example of the photo is using VR, and that's because a lot of people are investigating the use of things like the metaverse, and does that have a place? But overall, it's important to have a strategy and to work with your users to make sure that what you're doing aligns with your overall strategy and the organization strategy. Because you do want to meet your users where they are and be able to help them in a way that works best for them, but you don't want to roll out something that you aren't able to support. We've all seen those Twitter accounts where they just say, thank you so much for contacting us. Please DM us or please email us here with your contact info. If you're not really using the channel, you're not necessarily adding value to it. So the other thing that has come from the use of some of these modern channels is this real-time requirements, as I call it. People need things in real time, and they know about things before we do. I say here that sometimes our users know about issues hours before we do. There might be a network interruption because we have residential students. They'll be talking about it on social media, and they'll have active reports about it all while we're asleep. We don't want to live in that world. We want to make sure that we have a way to manage that. They're going to talk to each other, and they, are going to have things and communications, and they're even going to have workarounds established before we've even logged a problem ticket in our system. They might check if we have something posted, but they're not going to continue to check back if there isn't something posted. So this ends up being a problem because once we finally have the info out there, they've already gone out and started spreading their own information that might not involve us at all. So my best advice here is to get ahead of it. Provide the users with a means of reporting things like this, not just entering tickets, but if there is an outage, that might be a separate process or a sub-process for you to have things elevate. But also consider leveraging things like machine learning or artificial intelligence or other tooling that allows you to access data and process big data in a way that starts to make sense. A network outage is a silly example because generally we do know when that's going down because there is some failure or some way that we know about it, but there might be some more nuanced things that we might not see until the users themselves start to report it. If we have this data somewhere, but it's just about finding trends, this is where things like machine learning or AI are really good at detecting trends like that. And then the other big thing for this is to communicate early and often. The famous quote is, perfect is the enemy of good enough. But that is very true when it comes to communication. We'll spend a lot of time saying, well, we don't have a workaround yet, or we don't have a lot of info to communicate, but it is very important to get ahead of that and start to communicate. If there's an outage, get it up there and say, this is an ongoing thing. We're looking for more info. We're trying to get this. More info will be posted. This is the place to check back. Not only does that establish an authority, it makes it so that it looks like you're aware of things and on top of it. If you post it hours or days after the fact, you've lost a lot of trust to your users, and they're not going to keep checking that source of information. And as I say here, an issue does not need to be solved for you to share it. You can have info saying there's an outage, we're looking into it, and as you have it, just post more, but you do not need to fully resolve it before you share it out with your community. This one is a challenge that a lot of us are facing right now, with a huge focus on metrics and KPIs. As I say here, everyone has metrics, but not everyone uses metrics. You can replace metrics with KPI, dashboard reports, business intelligence, whatever it is you want to use as a term here. One of the problems that we have is that we are gathering tons of data, but we might not necessarily be realizing the value of that data. My advice here is that we need to start working better with our data consumers. If we're gathering tons of metrics, we need to make sure that we're showing them in a way that is valuable for the decision makers and for strategy. Operationally, we might know that the average ticket resolve time is 3 business days, but what do we do with that? Who needs to know that data, and why do they need to know that data? So as we think about establishing new metrics or working with the metrics that our systems already provide, we need to make sure that we are allowing those people that need to see it the ability to do it. And you need to make sure that you're building what those people want. If you don't yet have a metric, or you do have a metric that's not quite working, you either need to explain the value of that, but you also might want to just make what they need. And this one's really important, is you need to make sure that those people have access to it. There is a bit of narcissism on our part where we assume that they'll just log into the tool and use things. And sometimes with executives or higher levels, they might not be able to, or might not have the time to log in. Ideally, we all want them logging in real-time dashboards, seeing the most up-to-date data, but this might mean doing some less than ideal things. So for example, if you have an executive that really wants to know the current number of tickets across departments, you might want to schedule and automate an email for that. It's not as perfect as the amazing dashboard or report that you might have made, but if you schedule an email with those numbers and they're getting what they need to make those decisions, you are showing them the value of what it is that you do and bring to the table. The final one here is something that I'm guilty of, and a lot of us are probably guilty of too, is that we do need to standardize our metrics and document them. We'll create new fields, we'll create new attributes or metrics, but we don't explain how they're calculated, what they mean, and when to use them. And it's one of those things that we start to just know. You say, well, what does first call resolution mean? We assume that everyone knows it, but we might have our own special definition of it, or how we've calculated it. Or even doing things like saying, oh, well, we don't include tickets from this team because they are really an escalation team. And, that type of stuff does need to be documented so that whoever's consuming it understands that down the line. Or if you switch departments or teams, somebody else can look at it and understand where that's coming from. So one of the other big trends that I'm seeing is an issue with project management. We all want to do project management. We all might think we do project management. We might even have project management offices or groups or teams that are helping us do project management. But what I've seen happen in a lot of organizations is that we are doing this micro-level project management where teams are doing their own projects, and we're not necessarily sharing our info, and we're not standardizing it. So it's something that we all want, but we're all struggling to do. So it is important to know that project management is a real thing, and it does exist outside of the certifications that you get for it and business schools that tell you how important it is. But as far as project management goes, it's important to remember that it is a concept and not a tool. While our tooling can help support it, we don't want to get too stuck in that. And we do need to think about the strategic and operational levels. So if we think about the strategic level, we're thinking things like project portfolio management, which is where we're looking at all of our projects. Do we have the capacity for it? Where do these fit? What are the priorities? How do these align to our organizational strategy? But then we also have this need where there is the operational. What are the individual tasks to complete this? Who's doing those tasks? How do they relate to each other? How are we releasing those things? Are we using release management? Are we putting things into epics? Are we putting things into separate releases? What does that look like? The other important thing to remember is that Agile, Waterfall, whatever thing that you're using are structures to enable you to do project management, but not necessarily gospels. It's important to look at them and the things that they prescribe or the things they suggest because they are tried and true and they are written that way for a reason. But if something's not working, it's not best to just force it because the book says. It's also really important in my perspective for us to think about how we integrate project management and IT service management or enterprise service management. From that perspective, we'll have a lot of tickets that come in that are really project requests or enhancement requests or bug reports for a project. Having a means to convert between the two or manage the two so that you aren't impacting things like incident management with something that you know is going to be a 6-month project or something you can't get to for 6 months and then impacting the times for that. Enabling workflows and handoff between the two is really important. So this one might be a bit controversial, but shift left has been something that we've all been focusing on. Shift left is a wonderful idea. We want to take the work from the higher tier teams and we want to start moving it to lower tier teams, and we want to move it towards other areas as well. So we want to say incident prevention is the cheapest, self-service is also pretty cheap. Tier 1 should be able to do some things. We want to enable them to do things so they don't have to escalate for everything, and so on up the tiers. One of the things that we're running into, though, is that we might have hit some dead ends. We've shifted everything to tier 1, but we might not have shifted to self-service, or we might not have enabled that process to fully work as far as prevention, or not needing to have that self-service for something. And now tier 1 is really overworked and really busy, and they're expected to know a million things. And we have training and documentation and portals just for them to learn how to do their jobs, because we freed up so much time to put on our tier 1. And tier 1 is exhausted right now. So it's important to remember that shift left doesn't mean move from 3 to 2 and 2 to 1. It also means to think about things like self-service and prevention. It's not all about, using the cheaper cost labor to do the work. So as you think about your strategy for shifting work left, having strong self-service will take a lot of that load off. If you have something like a wireless setup that requires them to work with tier 1, think about how you can change that process to make it so that wireless setup for the network can be done by the end users directly, or maybe not need to be done at all. Evaluate those types of processes based off of reporting or things that you see happening a lot at tier 1, and try to find efficiencies to be gained there. With that in mind, there's other things in their workload that you can further shift left. Talk to them, talk to your teams, and say, hey, what are these things that you're seeing a lot of? Do you think there's any way in your mind that we could enable this to make it easier? What are your big problem points? Or are there things that we should stop supporting? Do we still support a very specific, operating system that's only used in this one team, but now we all have to learn it? Maybe we find a way to stop supporting that, or to modernize some of that type of stuff. So remember that it's not only about making those escalation tiers' lives easier, it's also about making your tier 1's lives easier. A humongous one. We've seen this everywhere. It is every presentation. The word experience has become pervasive, and I love that as a user experience PhD student. It is a huge focus of mine, and I think that it should be a huge focus of yours too. The reason that it's here as a challenge is because we haven't necessarily started thinking about it too much across our systems. We start to think about solutions and not experiences overall. And what that means is we say, well, we have a need, here's how we solve it. And then we have another need, here's how we solve it. We have another need, here's how we solve it. And many of those systems are kind of in their own little silos, and they don't work together as one end-to-end process. So what that means is that our users need to start to know a lot in order to engage with those systems. Instead of saying, how do I do this thing? They say, where do I need to go to do this thing? It's a slightly different turn of phrase, but it does start to matter, because then your users need to learn that they have to go to system A for the first thing, system B for the second thing. But we should start to think, what is the process to get from system A to system B to C and so on, if it is all part of the same type of workflow that our users have. And then we have this thing where we're focusing way too much on those metrics and solutions and not about the experiences that feed into those. So my suggestion here is start evaluating things like experience level agreements as a means of tracking the overall experience, and start thinking about the meaningful impact that you're having on the experience of your users, and not just the metrics that feed the overall thing. You might have an SLA, a service level agreement, that says, fulfill all of these types of requests within 3 days. But if all of your users are getting it within 3 days, but are mad and angry and they don't feel like they were helped, it's still not going to be good for them, even if you're meeting that target. Empathy is an amazing skill for you to learn, and you can use systems like design thinking in order to start and frame conversations from the point of view of the problems the users are facing from their own perspective. And it's important to start thinking about end-to-end processes. As an example, in higher ed, if we talked about the course registration process, we might start thinking, well, the first thing they need to do is log into the student information system. They then need to register for a class. Well, the first thing they need to do is not actually log into it, it's to engage with their account. They need to know how the account process works and which account to use if there's multiple. And then before that, it's going to be they need to use a computer. Well, do they have a computer? What if they have a Chromebook? Does it work on a Chromebook? What if they have an iPad? Does it work on an iPad? You need to start thinking about these types of things from the perspective of your users and how they're actually engaging with it, and start asking those questions about those steps that happen before the actual event and after the actual event. After registration, there might be questions you have like, how do they know that they're in the class? Are they confirmed? Do they have a way to check that and validate that they've made that right choice? As we start to think about systems, we can think about these things in little silos, but if we think about experience, it's that end-to-end. So one of the best ways to do this is to add experience to the process that you're fulfilling. You need to think about not just the system and the solution, but also what does the experience look like? What do we want it to look like? and then work with actual users and say, is it meeting that target? One way to do this is to implement really solid feedback surveys and continual improvement methodology. There's a lot of different ways you can do that. This isn't just doing Net Promoter Score and saying everyone's happy with us. It's also giving users a way to provide structured feedback and interviews, even focus groups, in order to establish that they are having a great experience. The final thing that we're encountering is this failure to launch. We attend webinars, conferences, and so many great sessions, and we see a lot of things that we want to do, but we never really get to it. There's so much wonderful information out there, and there's a lot of things that we all really want to get to, but we just kind of are our own worst enemy. So my best advice is just get to it. Start small and think big, and don't be afraid to be wrong. Starting somewhere towards one of these processes or changes that you want to make or a project that you've wanted to do is going to be a lot better than holding off and holding off and holding off. And it's really important that you make it through that in order to get where you need to go. Failure is not really a thing. You just learn a lot of things that you didn't know before. And with that, I thank you all for your time on this bit.
Chris, great presentation, really good insights, and I think really speaks to the challenges of not just the frontline service desk or help desk folks, but the ecosystem of everybody trying to provide support and services, particularly in higher ed, where we have such a diverse client base, customer base, constituent base. Everybody has different representations for how to support this. And on a campus, we have unique challenges that are particularly to higher ed. So today, what I'm going to speak to is how Freshworks, our product set, our mindset, the culture of the company is addressing those in real time. The ubiquitous disclaimer slide, Freshworks is a public company, so no forward-looking statements included in this discussion should be taken for any investment advice. Please take a look at the disclaimer statement, but I think you've all seen these many times before. I think that the interesting perspective here between Chris and myself, as a CIO within higher education and having worked within the industry for many years, the evolution of attempting to solve this challenge. How do we provide the right service and the right support, the right experience, as Chris was focused on, is a never-ending challenge. And I think that's one of the first things we need to keep in mind, is that this isn't about solving a problem. It's about putting yourself in a position to be continuously evolving in the problems that you are solving. So today, we're just going to touch on a little bit about the company and the challenges that have been presented to us from the higher education community that we see and that we have talked to our customers about, and how we are approaching solving those. So the company itself is a native SaaS company. It was founded in 2010. We have over 5,000 employees now, so quite a bit of growth, $500 million run rate. So the company was born in the cloud, established as a SaaS company, initially focused on industries, so commercial industries. Before we just had so much demand from the higher education sector, we began to add feature functionality and focus to being able to meet that need. Today we have over 58,000 enterprise customers around the world, and are a leader in all of your various quadrants of recognition. The higher ed match to the software is key here, right? Because any software that you have, regardless of the platform that you're using, is generally designed to solve a problem. What we're trying to recognize within the higher education community is solving a problem for just IT. As Chris said, the shift from ITSM to ESM. In an enterprise support context, if you have a top-down enterprise, you have a much better chance of creating consistent, static processes that can meet those needs. Optimize in a commercial setting, for example, optimize against ROI, or optimize against revenue, optimize against cost. But in higher education, what are you optimizing against? How do you balance the needs of a faculty member in the arts? If he is asking for assistance in his visual arts class, and you're going to balance that against a faculty member in chemistry who says she needs to have virtualized environments that are going to meet the needs of a chemist. Well, those should be two entirely different demands and needs, yet you have to respond to them on an equal footing with an equal level of competence. So when you think about a service center, it's never going to be a person. It's going to be an ecosystem of support needs. And that's true across higher education institutions, right? It's not just a single entity. It's many, many entities, each of which have to deliver often for the same constituent, but in different roles and different contexts. So think about it. We start with lifelong learning. You're a visitor to a campus. Then you become a prospect to a campus. At that point, maybe you're an applicant to the campus. You haven't yet formally matriculated into the campus, but you are part of that community. You're part of that constituency. The registrar then needs to know what your past experiences is. Did you enroll in a summer session? All of those things have to be taken into consideration. So if you're designing a solution that assumes somebody is within your container, a top-down piece of software, you're often going to leave out the most important part, which is every individual has different roles in higher ed. And throughout their lifelong learning process, they could become a student, a staff member. You might even have them as a faculty member. Then you have them as an alumnus, and then you have them as a returning student. So that has to be taken into consideration in your process design, which means you can't have one process. You got to have software and tools that allow you to have multiple processes. And understanding that each of those individual silos or functions within an enterprise, a campus enterprise, they all have their own metrics. They all have their own KPIs, and they all want to set their own experience points. What's their experience going to look like? That can be a real challenge because you want commonality, but at the same time, everybody wants locality. Everybody wants to localize. I've never met a higher education institution yet that didn't want to brand, not just at the campus level, but at the local department level, the school or college level, all the way down to the individual function, because they want to create that connection with all of their constituents for that specific need. Yet, at the same time, we have that understanding of this huge diversity. There's enormous pressures on transformation within the academy. Transformations around what a learner is. This idea of a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree is really being supplanted by the lifelong learning concepts. Certificates and badges, as well as traditional degrees, as well as the globalization that Chris touched on. These folks are going to be everywhere throughout their engagement with you. They could be anywhere. They could be taking a course on their phone at a bus stop or while in an airport in a foreign land. So we have to take all those things into consideration now. And unfortunately, we have to do so in an environment of constraint. From a financial perspective, we're seeing a greater and greater emphasis on finding ways to lower the cost to the learner and yet maintain the quality. So what are the big things that an education institution is dealing with that IT has to support, and in fact every division has to support? So the whole concept here of flipped classrooms and what happened with the acceleration that was created by the pandemic, well, MOOCs had already been on the scene. We'd already had quite a few online offerings previously, but we didn't have the model that said, in fact, those are the dominant paradigm now. We had a model that they were an option, but now if those are the dominant paradigm, right? If you are no longer going to expect to have Sage on the stage and somebody sitting teaching in a classroom, but in fact, vast groups of students engaging with one another, peer-to-peer learning, and have the lecture be replaced by objects that the student can engage with prior to having the learning happen, it changes the whole dynamic of the way you have to provide support as well. I'm old enough that I remember a time where we had people that would check to make sure there was chalk in the classroom before the lectures would start. And yes, we did have faculty that chose to use chalkboards instead of whiteboards. And yet the idea that you prepare for the physical space, we haven't done as good a job in preparing for this virtual space. So you need tools that are going to do that. We also need to recognize that the support model for students is something that is in constant flux. The pressures on students are changing more so than they ever were before. We don't have the same level of on-prem students. The idea that students are going to enter an institution and exit the institution after fully completing their education has been replaced by students that dip in and out of higher education in various ways. And yet they have to be able to have real-time support, because now everything being asynchronous, when they need access to it is when they have been able to carve out their time. Many students, of course, today are also full-time employed, or they are caring for loved ones. They have families at home, as well as traditional students that are in the classroom or on the campus. And yet you have to have a support model that's going to accommodate for all of those. Failure to do that in the old days would have impacted a student, a learner on your campus. Today, obviously, there is nothing that goes undetected. Yes, I think our students do spend time creating TikToks to explain just those experiences. So while, Chris, the IT team may not need a TikTok, they probably need to be monitoring some of the TikToks that are going to be talking about those learners' experiences, because you can learn a lot from the social media platforms and the engagement that our learners are having with each other, faculty, staff, students, even if you yourself are not actively presenting on those same platforms. So how do we do that, right? Where's the magic wand? Well, I think that the idea of the attempts in the past to create a single door, right, a portal that everybody would go through, have failed because in the higher ed context, there is no one door. Everybody needs to enter through multiple doors. But what you do need is an understanding that anybody entering in any one door is likely going to need to move to a different place, right? A student that starts out thinking they're having a problem with their online registration for a class may in fact have a problem in the registrar's office, not the technology. It may not be that they've not been able to log in because of a credential issue. It may be because they have an outstanding task to complete in another department or another division. So from a experience perspective, if you want to make that seamless experience, you need a way to seamlessly hand off between those organizations and those functions. And as Chris mentioned earlier, this idea that the single front end help desk tier one team is going to handle all of that should be replaced in your mind by not just a single point of contact, but also air traffic control. These folks now have to understand the context that the request is coming from and know how to solve many of them, but also how to route them within the ecosystem to the right place. Because the worst thing you can do is just keep handing somebody off. Well, the best way to solve that is to have some standard frameworks that your institution can use, and then deliver it with whatever channel, whichever door they're coming through. So that if somebody is contacting you for assistance and it turns out it's actually a facilities request, it's actually an HR related issue, it's something that should be at the school or college level, not at the institutional IT level. IT is the place that sees that more often than not, because as Chris mentioned, everybody's a technology organization today. There is no function on a campus that doesn't have a substantial investment and need for technology. And so if you're attempting to solve these problems as an IT organization, thinking that IT is the center of technology, it's not. IT is now a place that coordinates and engages the whole institution in the way it uses technology. And so that is where your software has to step up. It can't be a single siloed problem solve for a single area. It's got to be capable of flexing over time. And something that we need to think about is, in the past, you would buy a piece of technology to solve a problem. And often the problem was process related. So you would buy a product that would solve your problem because you have your process, or you're trying to get everybody to use a single process. I would challenge all of us to think that what we really need is to change our thought process around a single process being something that is actually much shorter lifespan than we think it is. Because the process to solve a problem has to evolve as fast as the new problems are emerging. So in the old days, you would optimize around, let's get a piece of software, we'll optimize around that process, we'll harden it, we'll make it so that it can route and get the solution. And then you end up sticking to that for far too long. You actually need to deprecate those processes faster than we ever have in the past, because new solutions are emerging all the time. And that creates new opportunities and new challenges. So you have to have a system that's open, has APIs that you can get to from any other system, and can leverage best practices or new widgets and new technologies, right? It's no longer about a single piece of software. It's about an ecosystem. So that starts by having a catalog of understanding of all of the possible solutions and all the possible problems. So you have a framework, whatever your institution is, you need to have a framework that says, okay, these areas have affinity. So it could be a geographic affinity, right? This campus has a satellite campus in Europe. Okay, so there's a satellite affinity there, but maybe the registrar process is the same for everybody internationally. So then you have a business process interface within your service catalog. And then you have technology interfaces within your service catalog around uptime and access and resource and capacity planning. All of those need to morph from the time somebody reports the issue or the need to the time it's resolved. It has to be able to morph, because the original definition of the problem is often not what the end problem ends up being. And everybody in this industry really understands that. So if you're training your front desk team to solve a problem, but forgetting that they need to be able to understand the context of the problem and morph it into what it possibly could be. If you don't have that flexibility in your teams, what you're going to end up with is people that are excellent at solving a narrow set of problems and are struggling with all of these other problems, because they'll say something to the effect of, well, that's in that department or that's somewhere else, so I can't do anything with it. And that lack of ownership, because they don't own the end resolution, will be felt by everybody who's trying to get a solution in place. So you want to have a really strong services catalog that allow you to have that flex between different roles and different functions. And then you want to be able to get to that service catalog. You want to be able to access it. You want to be able to gain visibility to it through the channels that are most relevant to your constituents. So I'm of the generation that still thinks email is efficient. But as we all know, it's only old people that use email today. My children are quite adept at writing their thesis on their phone with their thumbs, and they would much prefer to send a chat, a text, a message, than they would send me an email. Yet even they have different needs and different uses. Maybe they want to engage with an automated bot. Maybe they want to have a real-time two-way communication. Maybe they just want to be able to drop it into a bucket, or maybe they want to look up that resolution themselves. They want to provide self-service. And as you know, we all have faculty, and us ourselves, that would actually like to pick up the phone and talk to a real human being. I am often reminded that the things we carry around in our pockets actually are still called phones, even though they're rarely used for that purpose. So you need to have this multi-channel mindset, particularly when you think about ESM or campus-wide, because different constituents in different disciplines and different resource access are going to be able to want to reach you different ways. Chris mentioned, is it via a Chromebook? Have you tested it on an iPad? Have you tested it via, the different versions of Windows or Mac OS? But you also need to think about it as, what is the preferred channel people are coming in at? And how many of those channels can you effectively support? So that you can let people know, even if you don't have that support channel created, how to better guide them. So he mentioned the concept of, DM me in Twitter or send me an email in Twitter. Well, that's not really what Twitter was set up to do. So instead of just referring them to it, how do you re-guide them and direct them directly to that other option? So if somebody comes to you, let them send you an email if that's their preferred channel. Rather than sending an email and having it bounce back and say, please use your website to submit a ticket. That's not going to get you where you need to go. So you've got to be prepared to design a solution that's multi-channel and identify which of the channels for your constituencies do you need to put the most resources towards. And as they evolve over time, as your use of telephone lines reduces and email goes up, or chat goes up, or SMS goes up, how are you doing in responding to those different channels? This is where those metrics that Chris mentioned are so important, because you don't necessarily have to react to every metric, but you do need to have those trends so that you can see where you need to be shifting. I'm of the belief that virtually every one of these channels is a constant evolution, and you need to understand and deprecate those which are likely going to be of little use in the future. So you simply set expectations, not that they're forever available, but that they have a life cycle themselves, and you have some predictability to that. So as you're adding new channels or you're deprecating old channels, it becomes part of the life cycle that people are expecting. You also have to be able to tailor that UI, UX, right? The experience of what we think of as a primary portal, so that it can be locally branded. It's not just rebranded at your institutional level. As I said, everybody in your institution wants to brand locally. IT teams, they're one IT, or they're enterprise IT, or departmental IT maybe have, it's the College of Engineering IT organization is going to want a different identity from the institutional level IT. And maybe the student affairs organization has its own dorm IT support team, and they're going to want to brand separately. So you've got to have the flexibility in your portal, your branding, to be able to support as many sub-brands as possible, understanding that in some cases they'll want to affiliate with a master brand, and in other cases they'll want to be more dominant themselves. And in higher ed, that's really true. Now, what's interesting, of course, in the commercial world is that's the antithesis of what you see in the commercial world. Branding is controlled top-down. It's very rigid. It's very structured. You're not allowed to have, flexibility in how you brand. Everybody has an organizational name that is provided to you, and you can't change that. Well, in higher ed, I don't know of a name that has been forced upon anybody that lasts very long. So you want to have, very clean, very crisp, capable user experience that is also localizable to every individual entity that wants to participate in your ecosystem. So if you want to provide the framework for everybody to gain access, right, everybody to come in their door, you need to know that they're going to want to brand it. And if you can't do that, if you can't create some localization there, they'll stay outside. Those other sub-entities within your campus will want to maintain their own dominant identity, and maybe that's going to be really suboptimal because they're thinking about solving it for their individual constituency. And they forget that those constituents also are library constituents, their faculty, their facilities constituents, their IT constituents, and so they have to then, what ends up happening is they are the one that have to figure out how to cross every one of those barriers and boundaries. And that's really a seamful experience and not something that, we want to drive towards. So understanding that, we no longer live in a world of applications. We live in a world of applets and micro solutions and constantly evolving opportunities to solve new problems. For every one of these that's on this screen, they may be leading edge at any given time. They may be dominant in portions of your institution, but I can almost guarantee you there's a competitor that's also being used somewhere else on your campus, right? So maybe you're a Box campus, but you got a lot of people that use Dropbox. You got a lot of people that are using Google Drive. Well, everybody's on OneDrive now. The evolution of these is a constant challenge for support. So you want something that is also going to allow you from an API perspective to integrate much easier. If you are not building, assuming change, you're building for the wrong thing. Because no matter how much you can optimize, if we decide that we're going to support what's on the screen right now, we're going to roll out SurveyMonkey and the whole campus is going to use SurveyMonkey. There's going to be some department on campus that says, no, I'm staying with Qualtrics. It's the best thing since sliced bread. Right, they're going to demand the use of a specific tool for whatever reason. Again, that performing arts faculty member versus the School of Veterinary Medicine. they have more affinity with peers at other institutions sometimes than they do within their own institution. And so their ability to adopt new tools means you have to have a framework in place and a service catalog in place that can provide quick and easy additions as well as planned deprecation of things. So how does this look in practice with some of the campuses that are out there? So using one of the campuses, Judson University, a Christian university based in the Midwest, this campus is a smaller institution and really had some dated, this original top-down, everybody submit their ticket one way IT approach. And it also assumed some things no longer in evidence, right? It assumed that the vast majority of the tickets or the cases or the issues would be coming from on-prem, that would be coming from a similar experience. So students using the same kind of equipment or same kind of devices, right? We'll have, we'll set our standard and everybody needs to use these things. I defy anybody to tell me that they're going to demand people use just iOS as opposed to Android, right? You can't do that anymore. So when you set your processes up, that was pretty rigid. That also creates a real challenge when it comes to service level agreements. If you only have one thing to support, you create a pretty rigid service level agreement for that. But it quickly breaks down when you're not just supporting that. And then those things that are outside of that master service level agreement then aren't tracked or managed in a way that you can improve upon. And of course, then your ability to report is pretty challenged. So what we do with Freshservice and is something that I think is really helpful. So there's a lot of no-code and low-code capabilities in the product that Judson was able to use. They had a really nice modern UI that they were able to deploy and implement, and they did so recognizing that they could use, inbound traffic reporting. Where is this case coming from? What is the portal that it's being used? How's it being submitted? And then tailor that experience to be more appropriate for that particular entry point. And then when you expand to other global campuses, other, local, instead of just being on-prem, if you have people that are in New York, if you have people that are in Europe, if you have individual students that are coming in from not a formal campus, but anywhere in the world, they can also feel very supported because their unique experience of coming from that particular domain is going to be recognized and then supported. And then by using Freshworks to integrate under our Freshservice platform, you basically can then add additional support features elsewhere in the institution so that other departments who also want to support those same constituents understand that they can participate even if they aren't technology, but they are part of that process, life cycle. And in this case, just a huge jump in efficiency. They were able to meet the newly developed SLAs, dramatically so at 90%. The productivity measures that they were using previously jumped from 20% to 70%, and that was in great part because all of a sudden the visibility of the information wasn't just to the IT organization, but it was to everybody who was providing support and services, as well as to the learners who could look things up on their own. And then, of course, that anytime you can set those expectations, people are going to be happier, and that allowed them to spend less time with frustration and more time on planning for the new things that were coming. So that's a quick overview of the way Freshworks sees the space and how we're trying to design the software.
Thank you, Shelton and Chris, for an amazing presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this fantastic webinar. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.